Good morning. Whoever is there is the right people, I've always been told. So you are the right people here, but also obviously people online, because I understand this is also being streamed online. So welcome everybody to this session. Let me just briefly introduce ourselves. Pamela Jouven, SME Climate Hub, and I am Eelco Kruizinga. I'm from the Netherlands, and Pamela actually has more of a mixed background. She actually lives in the UK now, but she's actually has French, Italian pedigree.
Very European.
Very European. There's also a Brussels element there, but I'm just a simple Dutch guy, so I'm from the Netherlands. I represent DNV, Dat Norske Veritas, which is actually a Norwegian, well, foundation, you could say. Not an SME, to be honest. But okay, this morning's session is called a trainer session on carbon auditing. And these are actually two words which are actually sort of jarring already. Because first of all, the word carbon, I'm sort of inclined as a DNV person to say GHG, because there are GHG, greenhouse gases that don't contain carbon, for instance, like laughing gas, for instance. So I'd rather speak about GHG auditing. Having said that, most of the emissions from SMEs are probably in the space of carbon-carrying molecules. And then there's the word auditing as well, which may come across as bookkeeping, you're being checked by a third party, etc. That's not necessarily the case. So you have first-party auditing, you sort of self-assess yourself, do an internal audit of where you are with your emissions. There's definitely also second-party auditing, in which probably your clients to which you deliver your goods and services come to check you in terms of, in the supply chain, second-party auditing. And then there's third-party auditing, which is basically the space that DNV occupies to a large extent, which is like independent third-party checking of your emissions or your statements on emissions. There's two things, actually. You can actually check the emissions themselves or the statements you make or the claims you make in terms of emissions. Okay, there on the slide here you see a Slido, so definitely also for the people in the room, but also for the people online, you can sort of, if you have any questions, they're being sort of sent to the control room. You can upvote questions, and then they appear here on the screen, and we'll try to answer them towards the end of the session. Right, Pamela? Click, please. Thank you. So indeed, training the trainers. So we are assuming that you have some intent to actually develop some training or improve the training that you have in terms of GHG assessments or GHG auditing for your membership, constituency, or even maybe even your company and your sector and as well. So how we set this thing up is basically Pamela is going to set the scene in terms of why you should be interested in training SMEs in auditing or maybe preparing for audit, because it's probably the use case that we see a lot, actually people preparing for an audit, developing all of the routines, gathering the data, consolidating the data, and then present them in such a way that the life of an auditor becomes easier in a way. Then I'll be back after that. I will share some experience of what I believe needs to be included in a GHG auditing training, sort of the component parts, if you like, and some experiences that we have as DNV in terms of developing and delivering training as well. And then, I'm in the middle of the sandwich, then Pamela is coming back, and then she's going to speak about what the SME Climate Hub actually offers for SMEs as well. And then hopefully, because we're a bit stressed for time, we have some time for discussion and Q&A. We have some sort of, instructions from the organizers that we have to speed up a little bit. So without further ado, over to you, Pamela.
Thank you very much, Eelco. So just a reminder that we have a QR code here that you can scan. We're actually going to start by asking a few questions to the audience, both the people in the room and the people who've joined us online, to better understand who you are and what you might need from this session. And we're going to be using the same QR code for the Q&A at the end. So if you have your phones with you, and I can see many people have a phone in their hands already, do scan this QR code, and it's going to be the best way for you to interact with us. So let's see. We have a few questions, as I said before, just to understand who you are and where you're coming from. To start with, how would you best describe your business or organization? We want to know whether there are any SMEs in the room, once again, either here or virtually, and how big you are. Also, if you're an SME, do you have less than 250 employees, less than 50? Maybe you're a micro SME, you have less than 10 employees. Maybe you are an organization that works directly with SMEs, or maybe, SMEs are not in your field of work, which would be very surprising considering the theme of the conference, but we thought we'd leave that as an option just in case. Okay. So that's great to see. We actually do have some SMEs with us, but most of you seem to be working, of course, in organizations that support SMEs or that are somehow linked to SMEs. That's great. Okay. So let's see. Oh, just a few more people voting. So a lot of what I would call support organizations, so organizations that work directly with SMEs. Thank you for that. We now have a question also about, well, obviously, if you're not working with an SME, then you work supporting SMEs. And so if you think about these small businesses that you work with, would you say that they have measured and done a third-party audit of their carbon emissions, or maybe they've only measured their carbon emissions, or maybe they still need to get started, so they haven't measured their carbon emissions, or they don't even know how to do it? Once again, it would be really interesting to understand where you're at in your journey, or where your SMEs are at in their journey. Okay. Once again, it's quite equally spread out, I would say, but it seems that most of the SMEs that are either represented in the room or that the audience work with still need to get started on measurement. So a lot of them haven't measured their carbon emissions or don't even know whether their business has measured carbon emissions. Very helpful. And one last question for you all. How confident are the SMEs you work with in measuring and reporting their emissions? So would you say that they're very confident? Obviously, this only applies to the ones who are doing it already. And even the ones who are doing it don't seem to be very confident. Well, that's very encouraging. Seems to indicate that this session is going to be helpful to all the people in the room. So let's get started. And as Eelco said, I'm just going to provide a little bit of context to get us started and talk about carbon accounting or measurement, reporting, auditing. So a lot of terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, but I think it's important to make a distinction and really understand the pros and cons of each one of these steps. So if we start with carbon measurement or accounting, that's basically the same thing. I think it's fair to say that for most SMEs, for most businesses really, this is going to be the first step on their climate action journey. I'm sure you will have heard this before, but you obviously cannot act on what you don't know or don't understand. So measuring your emissions is a great way to understand how you can pull together a meaningful strategy to reduce them. And so when you measure your emissions, you're able to identify hotspots across your business, whether that's in your own operations, maybe your own vehicles or machinery, or maybe the hotspots are in your supply chain. Either way, measuring your emissions is a great way to understand how to get started. Now, reporting is also increasingly becoming a driver for action and accountability when it comes to SMEs. I think it's fair to say that up until recently, SMEs were left out of some of these asks, whether they were about measuring emissions, disclosing them, or setting science-aligned climate targets. But this now is changing. So we're seeing an evolution in the ecosystem and additional expectations when it comes to SMEs. So first of all, we have standard-setting organizations like ISO, for example, or SBTi, the Science-Based Target Initiative, that are now setting up standards for SMEs specifically. We also see large corporates, for example, large buyers, who now have expectations. So they expect their suppliers, including their SME suppliers, to take action so that they, in turn, can achieve their own climate targets related to Scope 3 emissions, so basically supply chain emissions. And then we're also seeing new regulations come into force. Now, this is still very much being worked on. Most of the regulations at the moment don't apply to SMEs, but many of you will be aware of the new standards that are being worked on at European level for SME reporting. So VSME, which is a voluntary standard for SMEs, and then LSME, and that's, once again, a standard, but for listed SMEs this time. As I said, still being worked on by EFRAG, will be submitted to the European Commission by the end of this year, so in the first part of next year, we'll have a better idea of what we're dealing with. So all of this is happening, of course, but there's still a need for consistency. So right now, the question is, what is the appropriate level of reporting for SMEs? Once again, the standards that the European Union is working on will provide a direction, but there's still questions out there about how much we should ask SMEs, depending on where they are in their journey, how big they are, and how much they can provide. Now, either way, we know that measurement and reporting do come with benefits for SMEs, all the benefits that are related to climate action, whether that's improving efficiencies in your business or reducing costs, growing your brand, gaining easier access to finance or customers. But SMEs need additional incentives. It's important for corporates to incentivize their suppliers, banks to incentivize their clients. They can link their lending conditions to climate performance, for example. The ecosystem really needs to work together to support SMEs. Now, let's talk about third-party audits and assurance, and Eelco was already telling you about what this means. So once again, here we're talking about working with third-party stakeholders to validate carbon accounting and provide assurance. And I wanted to mention a study, the report that was published earlier this year by MIT about assurance. There's actually an interesting stat that I wanted to share. So this study is called On the Importance of Assurance in Carbon Accounting, and this analysis claims, among other things, that firms that obtain assurance for their carbon accounting report on average a 9.5% higher carbon intensity than their peers. So that basically means that companies that get assurance of their carbon reporting tend to use more complete data sets and therefore more useful data sets. So there are definitely benefits in going through a third-party audit. That said, we also know that it's a complex and costly process for many SMEs. So once again, it raises the question of what's suitable for SMEs depending on where they're at. And I have a graph that I wanted to share with you, if the clicker allows. There you go. So among other things, I'll talk about the work that we do with the SME Climate Hub later on, but we have a number of committed SMEs that are part of our community and that report their carbon data. And as you can see here, so this is data from our 2023 reporting, there are a lot of SMEs that are very low emitting, and then some SMEs, and they can even be small, but that are very high emitting. So you see that dot in the upper left-hand corner. And so for these SMEs, it might make sense to go through a third-party audit because, once again, they're either large or high emitting. Maybe they're part of corporate value chains and are working with buyers that expect them to do so. But for many other SMEs, measuring their emissions and maybe reporting them, but without going through complex processes, will be more helpful. We don't want perfection to get in the way of action. And finally, just a few more stats to finish setting the scene from our survey. So once again, we run annual surveys at the SME Climate Hub. And as you can see, and bear in mind that these are the SMEs that are part of our community, almost 40% of them say that they lack data about current emissions, and over half of them say that they need tools for measuring and monitoring emissions. And so that really shows that, once again, the ecosystem needs to provide additional support and incentives. Large corporates, for example, can upskill their SME suppliers, but other organizations, probably like the ones you're working with, can also direct them to platforms where support is available, like the Hub. So there we go. This was just a little bit of context. Hopefully will help frame the discussion. There you go. So Eelco.
Oh, thank you.
Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pamela. So just briefly, DNV, most people know it from DNV certification. So we've been around for quite a while now, it's 160 years this year actually. And it's just important to reiterate our purpose is safeguarding life, property, and the environment. So we're really concerned about reporting correctly about emissions. So that's important to us. It's part of our purpose. And we'd like to be a trusted voice to tackle global transformations. That is our purpose, and we're sort of, I am actually in the energy group, energy systems it's called in DNV. So I do lots of work in decarbonisation studies. So it's not just auditing, it's also doing something about it, basically. So because I'm not a bookkeeper, I'm not an auditor myself, so I'm sort of in decarbonisation roadmaps at sectoral level in particular. But it starts with auditing, understanding where you stand and where you can go from there. So my most people know us from the certification, verification, and testing work that we do. You can see those, the management system certification, ISO certification. Most people know DNV from that sort of side of things. Other people know DNV from ships and ship classification. That's also what we do. We also, qualify and assure new technologies as well. I'm sort of in the expert advice group, and we also develop rules and standards ourselves. And standards are important also in GHG auditing as well. And I'll get back to that just later on. If you develop training in terms of GHG auditing, you also need to understand to what sort of standard am I developing what sort of standard am I adhering to, or what set of standards am I adhering to. So I could end this whole presentation by this just single slide, because this is what I believe are GHG audit training elements. So if you develop training, and this would be the luxury version. So if everything would be in there, it would have these component parts. And I think you could sort of, cover this in sort of 3 days, more or less, if you sort of, not 3 consecutive, like in blocks, if you like. So to my experience, top left-hand corner, you need to be saying something around, so why are we doing this in the first place? So you need to be saying something about climate and climate change, some sort of basic information. What is greenhouse gas? What is it actually? What does it do? So what are the various greenhouse gases, and what gases are important for your sector as well? Need to understand something around the policies, the policy landscape in Europe, and also particularly, and Pamela addressed that as well, what are the drivers for your clientele, for your business to pay attention to this? I mean, there are several drivers. There's, first and foremost, efficiency. You can sort of detect where you have inefficiencies, if you like. There's compliance reasons. There's also, winning new business. For instance, in the Netherlands, if you want to, be involved in procurement for public sector, you have to sort of show in many cases that you are contributing to reducing CO2 emissions as well. So that's one thing, background. Could be just one slide, could be a whole afternoon if you like. Benefits, obviously, so what are the benefits? I was saying, profiling, gaining market share, but sometimes it's also a license to operate, so compliance as well. Then thirdly, in the middle top row, you need to present some sort of step-by-step process, and there are steps involved here, which are pretty similar all over. If they're not all the same, but generally, so they are sort of similar. And then, being a DNV person, I think you need to be saying something around standards that are out there for your sector. But also the labels that are out there as well. So you're probably familiar with all the labels that are out there in terms of the emissions, but also into net zero labels. There's also product labels. So you don't look at the company as a sort of like the unit of analysis, but you could look at one single product, like a porcelain cup or something. What is the carbon footprint of that one single cup? So it's also about labels. So choose whatever standards you believe are important for your training, and also what labels you are sort of promoting through your training. Then, top right-hand corner is, and we addressed that briefly already, is tell something around the auditing ecosystem, the levels of audit as well. Explain terms like validation, verification, certification, first, second, and third party audit as well. I'm not saying you always have to do a third party because I'm DNV. That's not what I'm saying. It's your first party is also very good because it gives you insight in where you stand. It gives you sort of a platform, a springboard, if you like, from which you can start to improve and reduce your emissions as well. The middle layer is maybe a bit hard to see with the blue on blue here. Is you need to be saying something around, okay, what are the principles of reporting? So what am I reporting? What data am I using? What are the assumptions behind my data? Because transparency in reporting is key here. And that's, I think, as DNV, probably So it's SME Climate accuracy and relevance and reporting with the right sort of assumptions and with the right transparency is key here. Then you may know this from the people who know the GHG protocol, GHGP, probably people know that. You know, there's a whole section on, so what is the unit of analysis here? What am I reporting on actually? Yeah, okay, the organization, but what is actually the organization? What are the boundaries of an organization? Now, in many cases, that's not so simple because you might have like a complex ownership structure, you might have, you know, affiliates as well. So you need to be setting the right boundaries for reporting, not only in terms of you know, where you have financial control or where you may have operational control, but also in terms of the time, and that's the next box here, the time reporting boundary. So what is the base year that you're basing yourself on? Because as we all know, companies develop over time, they grow, they shrink, they have, you know, there might be acquisitions, you might, you know, diversify your product portfolio, so your emissions might, you know, fluctuate as a result of that, and you might not even see a reduction, and that might be strange. So the time reporting boundaries are very important as well. Then obviously, the fourth box there is the GHG calculations, because that's what it is all about, of course. So how do you calculate the emissions themselves, and where can you find the data, and how can you sort of translate those data into actual emissions data? Probably everybody has heard of, you know, CO2 equivalent, you know, the word equivalent there. So what does it actually all mean? Then a little box there towards the far right, sounds a bit strange now, but the quality assurance and quality control, and in terms of, that's very important as well, because you hopefully you won't be doing this just like a one-off, but you want to be doing this over time as well, because you want to see progress, you want to be monitoring over time as well. So you want to assure that you have, you know, the right data management procedures and management systems for that. Bottom layer is probably a bit, how do you say that, like non-obligatory. It's like a nice to have in a training. So you might, when you want to be covering scope 3 as well. Offsetting might be a topic. Are you familiar with the term offsetting? Probably you are, offsetting. So the emissions you can't reduce anymore, you could sort of buy carbon credits from accredited offsetting projects as well. So the last remaining, if you like, emissions, you could offset them as well. Some people use the word inset as well, if it's in the supply chain, but offsetting is the general term. Then, if relevant in your training, you might be covering LCA, life cycle analysis. That is actually the where you have the unit analysis is not the organization, but actually the product as well, and that might be quite interesting for SMEs to have a look at. It's a completely different field as carbon auditing. The life cycle analysis, you have all kinds of databases to check, like the emissions over the life cycle, you know, cradle to grave. And you're probably familiar with that sort of world as well. And then fourthly, on the bottom layer is carbon neutrality. You might want to cover that as well in your training. You might be saying something around that. There's standards in that field as well, past 6,000, and there's different ways of looking at carbon neutrality. And I think demystifying carbon neutrality is also an important element of training, to my experience. And then lastly, in the bottom right-hand corner is the whole reporting and the various tools that are out there to support digital reporting in terms of disclosure type of software, whether it's, you know, standalone software you run on your machine, or whether it's like an online provision on the web where you have a safe and secure environment, where you have the additional benefit. For instance, you could, you know, if you use those online tools, you have the additional benefit to benchmark as well. Not only you as a provider of data, but also your customers could sort of benchmark you against others as well, which is a quite interesting process. And obviously, you want to have in your training some sort of case study, like, you know, where people can practice with the material offered as well, with a, you know, a sample company that is representative for your group of SMEs, the sectors that they work in. I can't say anything more specific on that as well. Okay, what I'm going to do now is probably going to quickly through a number of deep dives in some of, not all of these boxes. There's far too much because it will cost 3 days, as I just said. just do a deep dive of my experience, what you need to be covering in each of these, in some of these boxes. Okay, standards, standards and labels. So the next slide is going to scare you, and it should. Because there are so many standards, so many. Even for us, it's hard to follow. And I already know. I did check because I got this from a colleague actually, and said, okay, one standard is not on there. It's actually the CSRD ESRS E1 standard is not there, which is one of the relevant ones. So this is a continuously developing field, which I think you need to be aware of, and maybe also communicate to in your training. So there's standards at the UN level, top left-hand arm. There's national standards. There's corporate GHG reporting and target setting standards. GHG protocol being one of the most seminal ones, you could say. And there's a whole business here of voluntary trading, voluntary carbon market standards, which are basically there. So, quick summary. Basically are there to sort of certify offsetting projects as well, to make sure that if you buy carbon credits, you're really sure that it is a bona fide investment with the right returns Yeah. So I think in your training you need to be highlighting the standards landscape or a subsection of that is relevant for your audience as well. Probably that takes a little bit of investment to sort of do this as well, but there are resources out there for sure to sort of make a selection. Okay, so just on the standards, I think you need to be saying something around the various types of standards. So you have project standards, in the offsetting world. There are company activity standards, which basically look at a certain activity in your organization and company. It might be emissions associated with travel, for instance. It's like an element of your emissions. There are compliance standards as well, so license to operate type of standards, and there is obviously corporate standards as well. Actually, I'm not sure whether we are sharing the slides or somehow on a website. That would be actually quite good as well, because I don't have the intention to go through all of the items. It's just want to highlight that you have to sort of be looking at the types of standards. And then there's the product-based standards, standards around product footprint claims as well. So what are the emissions associated with the production or part of the production? Product-related reduced GHG footprint, so the standards related to the reduction that you achieve with producing something. Carbon neutrality standards associated with the product, and then obviously there's also product negative emission type of standards. So there's a whole host of, it's a whole world, whole cosmos of standards. It's making the right choices here is important if you develop training as well. Now, probably you don't want to have like a course where you have all of the standards there, because that's probably not relevant for SMEs at all, but selecting the right ones is relevant. Okay, just also identify which labels are important to your constituency. I just went to, in preparation for this session, to this site, Eco Label Index. It's quite interesting, actually. And I just typed in, okay, all eco labels matching carbon. So, and this is not complete. This is 35 already. So there are so many of these eco labels around, and understanding what eco labels are important to your in your training is something that I would recommend you do as well. Oh, sorry, and there's also all kinds of supporting tools associated with achieving a certain label as well. Okay, so also I think you need to be highlighting in your training the principles of GHG reporting. So whatever you report needs to be relevant for the standard, but also relevant for your stakeholders. It might be your clients, but it might also be your investors, the banks behind you. Completeness is very important. Accuracy. So we really believe in that. Transparency, so how you got to the data. So I'm not saying you have to sort of directly measure your emissions by having some sort of measurement equipment, but you need to be transparent about how you got to the data. To what database did you go to find your emission factors, for instance? What did you use? And consistency over time as well. Yeah, consistency over time, but also consistency within the boundaries of your organization. So you need to sort of be able to roll up the data into one using a consistent method. To the right here, you see the greenhouse gas protocol reporting standard. There's lots of guidance in there, and I highly recommend to have a look at that. It's very good material. The website that they have is not only the standard itself, there's also all kinds of guidance and tools there as well. Okay, just briefly explain the importance of setting boundaries. I just discussed that. So the business vary in legal and organizational structures. So that always raises the question, so what am I reporting on actually? What are the boundaries of my report here as well? A greenhouse gas protocol says that there are two types of consolidation approaches. So you could be looking at the equity share approach or operational control type of approach. You just have to choose there as well. And what also you need to be doing is, okay, what GHG do I need to include? Relevant, because if you're just a small travel agent, I'm not assuming that you have fugitive emissions like methane or something. So you don't have to report those. So, and GHG sources, which direct emissions do I account for, and which indirect emissions do I include? Scope 1, Scope 2, and maybe some of Scope 3 as well. Which reporting period, so what is the length that I'm reporting on, and which geographical operations to include or exclude as well. Now, the words, Pamela was already speaking about scopes. I'm assuming that you're familiar with Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. If that's a riddle to you, then just shout. But basically, Scope 1 is the emissions from source owned, controlled by sources owned or controlled by the company. And then Scope 2 is the emissions that are generated from the electricity that you buy. Yeah? That's important. So if you buy electricity from a coal-fired power plant, then you have indirect emissions, if you like. If you buy electricity from like a renewable energy, then clearly your emissions are much lower, if not zero. But you also need to be having proof of that, obviously, and you can get proof from your utility as well. You can have like certificates of origin and stuff like that as well. So it's also about proof. So most people report on Scope 1 and Scope 3. Yeah. Sorry, 2. Sorry. Scope 3 is what the next thing is. And Scope 3 is all of the other indirect emissions as well. So Scope 3 are emissions that are a consequence of the activities of the company, but occur from sources not owned or controlled by the company. So for instance, my flight here to Budapest from Amsterdam is, those emissions were generated by a resource controlled by the airline, KLM, right? I'm not responsible for that, but it's Scope 3 for my company, right? So that's what it is. Scope 3 occurs both upstream, so from all of the purchases that you do, but also downstream from what your clients do with your stuff that you produce, your products, and probably products mostly, and services. So this is important. The scope world is used all the time. So you need to be communicating Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And there's much more detail because there are all kinds of categories within Scope 3, for instance, so you can be explaining that. But it's only relevant if you want to be reporting on Scope 3 to begin with. Time boundaries, won't go into that, but it's important to also say something around, okay, what is the emission levels over time as well, as companies undergo changes, obviously, both in terms of acquisitions, but also the types of stuff that you produce as well. Then there's a difference between base year and baseline. Okay, I won't be covering that for now. Then calculations, GHG calculations. It's very, very simple steps. Okay, identify your GHG sources, what emits in Scope 1. Select the GHG emission calculation approach, or you could say look-up approach in some cases. Collect activity data and choose the emission factors associated with activities that you do, and then roll them up, basically. And there are sort of 4 ways of measuring or establishing your emissions. So direct measurement, obviously, you can have like, if you have a factory, you can have, the fuel being used by a certain piece of equipment. You can just directly measure that. You can use chemical equations. Some people do that as well. But you can also look up, literature-based emission factors. I'm sure that you're familiar with these emission factor databases. You can just go, gray, like for instance, scope 2, gray electricity. What is the emission factor for that power plant? You can just go in Netherlands. You can go to a database. You say, oh, that is the emission factor for that one. And there's national databases. I'm sure also in Hungary here and elsewhere in Europe. And you can use calculation models and tools. But typically the formula is quite simple. It's like you have your activity data. So how many miles or kilometers did I drive? You have an emission factor, associated with the type of car that I'm driving, the fuel that's being used by that car, and then you have your GHG emissions, right? So that's pretty simple. Obviously, if you have a chemical plant or have some sort of process equipment, it becomes a little bit more difficult, obviously. But in most cases, it's quite straightforward. So, for instance, we are using this, like a toy sort of little company as an example in our course. It's called Cupcake.bv, basically a little bakery producing cupcakes, if you like. So it's right in the middle there, bottom layer. So Cupcake BV, what they do is in the scope 1, they have like a little van driving around on gasoline. And scope 2 is great. They have their ovens, have an oven running on electricity, and they purchase that electricity. Very, very, very simple. What would be optional for this company would be to look at scope 3 upstream. So what is actually the footprint of the stuff that I buy, from elsewhere, and what is the footprint associated with the transport to the doors of my business as well? That would be scope 3 upstream. And then scope 3 downstream, in this simple example. So what are the emissions associated with, selling my stuff in the supermarket? What are the emissions associated with the consumers? And what are the emissions associated with waste? Now you can already start to see that it's actually quite complicated to establish that, the scope 3 downstream as well. It's really hard to find data on that as well. So that's why scope 3 is typically seen as difficult. Now, let's have a look at a little cupcake. So this looks a bit scary maybe, but it's actually quite simple. So suppose you have activity data and emission factors for cupcake. So scope 1 would be the gasoline used for the delivery. So you have 20 kilometers for a return trip. You have 250 delivery days per year. The emission factor for the gasoline that you're using is what is set there, and you have a certain fuel efficiency for the vehicle that you're driving. And then your scope 2 would be the electricity used for the location, and then your annual invoice. You have an invoice of 7,500 kilowatt hours, and you look up the electricity emission factor that is shown there as well. Tank to well, TTW. And then, just simple calculations. Scope 1 emissions, you can 804.7 kilograms, and then scope 2 emissions would be 2,970 as well. You can see already start to see the the relative importance of the emissions of that little vehicle compared to electricity that you're using, knowing that this is gray electricity. Yeah. So this little company, if they want to reduce their emissions, scope 1, scope 2, it would be really good to look for green power, if you like, rather than gray power. That probably is a better investment than driving maybe like an electric van, from a distance. Okay, scope 3. How much time do I have? Okay.
We have a...
Okay, so right, I'll finish this in like 5 minutes or so. So also in your courses, probably you need to be providing reasons why to look at scope 3. And as you can see in the sort of little diagrams to the right there, so you have 4 large corporates who have a big supply chain, right? So Apple, Tetra Pak, Unilever. And if you look closely, the gray there, the scope 3 is actually huge. You can see that they are sort of indirectly responsible for lots of emissions because of the supply chain upstream, but also in terms of the consumers using the products downstream as well. So these types of companies are looking at SMEs, their supply chain, obviously, to say, I was talking about second party audits. So because they start to feel they start to feel more responsibility for the emissions also in scope 3. So that's why the SMEs are also confronted with, okay, could you show us what your emissions are? Because if the emissions from somebody else are lower, maybe I'm sort of inclined to go there as well. So that you're getting involved, if you like, in sort of helping to reduce the overall emissions of, on the planet, basically. Let's face it. So these larger companies are looking at their scope 3, and that's why SMEs get involved are being involved for that reason. Okay, LCA quickly. Just in this little table to the left-hand side here. So the LCA life cycle analysis is really the carbon footprint of one single ceramic cup, so the second or the third row there, whereas the GHG audit is more looking at the carbon footprint of the organization, of the ceramic cup producer. So what you need to understand here is that LCA has completely different types of tools and processes to sort of create the proof of what the LCA might be. It's also used in sort of product development as well. If you start to develop a product, you start to sort of investigate. So what is the life cycle emissions of that potential product compared to another type of product? So it's also in terms of the design and manufacturing preparation as well. Okay, carbon neutrality. If relevant, include that in your training. So you see here not an exhaustive list of logos, but some of them you probably have seen as well. But these are sort of carbon neutrality claims that are linked to either a company or a product. Okay, so to skip this, so you have past 2060, you have the carbon neutral protocol, you have the net zero definition used in ISO guidance, so there's also lots of guidance there as well, and you need to understand that guidance. This is hopefully my penultimate slide. Yes, I think what you need to be doing in whatever training that you be providing is to discuss the topic of greenwashing. Let's face it. So these days, some people are using the word carbon washing rather than greenwashing, because greenwashing is already a bit of an old term. You use it to biodegradable plastics and stuff like that. Impact on the environment, that is more greenwashing. And then carbon washing is painting a rosy picture of your emissions. Yeah. I invite you to have a look at these two sort of resources on the right there, and you can see that there is a sort of even a development that companies are trying to be silent on their emissions, because being open, disclosing information, also exposes you to criticism, and so that's rolling back to my slide on transparency. That's why transparency and accuracy is really important, because that is your line of defense, being clear about things, right? Okay, yes, lessons. Okay. Yes, okay, so lessons from this is my final slide. Lessons from training: have a unifying case study in your training. Make it work for your type of audience. So if you have travel agents, then have your example as a travel agent. If you have chemical companies, then use chemical company as your example. Create a mix between reading, listening, and also practice. Just playing around with those calculations, looking at examples as well, and you can sort of we have good experience with video-based resources as well. Select and use a simple tools to support calculations, and I will refer to Pamela, who will sort of cover that, especially the simple element there as well. Also have good experience with letting people work in small teams, so that definitely from different companies, so they can sort of discuss things. How do you do this? Or what is oh, that's scope 2 for you. Oh, right, okay, scope 1. Well, interesting, yeah. And also leave some time between sessions for people to reflect and prepare, because I already know that this session is already very, very dense, if you like. So you just have like 1 hour little blocks, and then have some space in between. And with that, there's some further slides with some resources. Want to point to a number of resources online. There's a project that has been finished, Covenant of Companies for Climate and Energy. Both Pamela and myself were involved in that. There's a best practice guide was developed there. There's a clean energy transition guide there. There's online masterclasses there. You can just look them. They are sort of free of charge. And also I want to point to a Spanish website. It's called AH. My Spanish is not so good, but it's actually the Carbon Footprint Association, Asociación de Huella de Carbón, I think. And what they have is actually online very good online training. I really highly recommend that. So they run a group of volunteers in Spain that help small and medium-sized enterprises. So their whole model is train up volunteers, and volunteers then help SMEs. Really, really cool, and highly recommend it. And with that, I'd like to hand back over to Pamela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eelco, for a very comprehensive presentation. So I'm sure you will have understood from all the slides that Eelco went through that carbon accounting and audits are obviously incredibly important, including for SMEs, but can also be complex. And so to wrap up this session, we just wanted to highlight some resources that are available for SMEs who are getting started, or also for organizations who are getting started in supporting their SMEs. And so this is the initiative that I lead on. It's called the SME Climate Hub. In a nutshell, we are a one-stop shop platform for SME climate action. We are a global initiative that is hosted by the We Mean Business Coalition, and we support small and medium-sized enterprises in taking action. Our offering is based on 3 pillars. First of all, we have a commitment that's available on the platform that is aligned with science and the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. SMEs can sign this commitment. When they do, they automatically join the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, which is one of our co-founders. Then we offer a whole range of tools and resources that are specifically designed for SMEs and completely free of charge. They go from very simple, PDF guides all the way to interactive courses. We recently launched a new section of the website that is called the Action Space that provides a tailored user experience to SMEs. They can filter the tools that make most sense to them depending on their maturity level, even their sector in some cases. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then behind the scenes, in addition to all that's available on the digital platform, we work a lot with the rest of the ecosystem, from governments to corporates, once again to streamline the path to net zero for SMEs. And we are, as I said before, we're the official pathway, we're the official entry point for SMEs to join the United Nations Race to Zero campaign. Now, I'm only going to focus on a couple of tools that we're offering so that we have hopefully a couple of minutes for questions. And I wanted to highlight the tools that we offer for carbon measurement and reporting. Our SME carbon calculators. This session is actually very timely for us because we just made an announcement and we're going to evolve our offering in terms of carbon measurement tools. So up until now, we've had a simplified measurement tool available on the platform that we co-developed with Normative, but we're about to launch 3 new tools that are going to be available in early 2025. You can see here that they will help SMEs measure their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but again, they will be tailored to different types of SMEs. So we're going to have a very simple tool suited to smaller SMEs, so with less than 50 employees and simpler operations. All of this is going to be interactive. SMEs are going to be able to input simple data points to get estimates of their carbon emissions. We're also going to have a more sophisticated Excel-based and auditable calculator for larger SMEs, a bit more advanced, that might have operations across multiple sites or countries. And then we're going to have a specific calculator to help SMEs understand their Scope 3 emissions and identify their highest emitting suppliers. And this is going to be using procurement spend data. So this is what we are already offering, or will be offering, in terms of carbon measurement. And then we also have an SME reporting tool. So SMEs who've made the commitment on the hub are required to report on an annual basis. And we launched our reporting tool, the first version, last year. This tool is based on a disclosure framework that we co-developed with CDP. And we recently launched a 2.0 version that takes into account all the developments that we're seeing in the ecosystem, upcoming regulations, and other types of changes. And through this tool, once again, tailored to SMEs, small businesses can report their annual greenhouse gas emissions, but also the actions that they're taking to reduce their emissions and the impact of their reduction plans. We also have some optional sections about strategy and governance that SMEs can fill in, because we know that some stakeholders such as banks will be interested in seeing this. And all the reports that are submitted through the hub are publicly accessible. We have a searchable database of our SMEs where the reports are directly available. And last but not least, we don't want SMEs to do the work twice, so if they've reported through other platforms, they're welcome to upload their existing reports onto the hub. Once again, very happy to answer any questions about these tools in the very short Q&A that we're going to have. Just wanted to highlight some quotes from SMEs that are part of our community, and as you can see, they're definitely finding our tools helpful, whether that's our carbon calculators that help understand what their sustainability goals are, or our reporting tools, which once again are tailored to SMEs, but also completely free of charge. And so that really does make a difference to many SMEs that we work with. Last quote here. I'm not going to read it out loud so that we have 1 minute or two for questions. Let's see. Once again, QR code. We might already have That's too soon. We might already have a few questions from our online audience. If there are any questions in the room, of course, feel free to raise your hand, shout. We can be very old school as well. And I'm assuming that the online, please.
Well, just coming back to my cupcake example, that's an example that people can do that pretty much on their own. But if you have like a factory where, people can do it on themselves as well, because then they have professionals helping them. Many of these tools actually have guidance in there, so you can come a long way. But I think starting, it could be useful to follow a course first, I would say. So a combination of doing a course and then prepare your data. That's something that's a modality I would recommend as well. Yeah.
And I will just add, so if you're a smaller SME or an SME getting started, you will find a lot of value in some of the tools that are available, for example, on the hub. If you're looking to get more sophisticated estimates, then it might make sense for you to work with an organization that's going to really support you in analyzing your carbon emissions. So it really depends on how sophisticated your business is, but also where you're at in your journey.
Yeah, complexity also comes from these organizational boundaries discussion as well. That makes things quite complex. It could be. Yeah. Gentleman over there. Yeah.
I was wondering, what are the incentives for SMEs to take these audits, and are there some good examples from different governments in Europe?
Very good question.
And or is it self-motivation based at first? But could you please elaborate?
Excellent question. So you don't want to do GHG auditing for the sake of it. There needs to be a very good reason. Maybe you can sort of start with.
Yeah, of course. So once again, we're talking about auditing. I personally draw a distinction between measurement and auditing, because for me, auditing is about going through a third-party audit and official assurance. But either way, as we said at the beginning, the expectations are changing in the ecosystem. So SMEs, up until now, haven't been targeted really by regulations, but this is changing. So large buyers, once again, will increasingly be looking at their suppliers to take action and reduce their emissions so that they can achieve their Scope 3 targets. And then we have upcoming regulations, including in Europe, that will require SMEs to report. So it's a changing ecosystem. It's important for SMEs to get started now so that they don't get behind, that they're ahead of the curve. And once again, we're already seeing that SMEs who are taking action get business benefits in terms of, customer loyalty, reducing costs, improving efficiencies. It's not as obvious as we'd like it to be yet, but things are evolving very fast, so it's important to take action now.
Yeah, but just in addition, so typically it's also about efficiencies, right? So emissions come from somewhere. It's about you burn something or you spill something or something escapes, basically. So there are potential inefficiencies to be improved as well. So there could be very much internal reasons as well. But I fully agree with what you're saying. There's pressure from the outside in terms, it's not about license to operate, but organizations, the world are looking at Scope 3 emissions, and SMEs are very much in that place in many cases.
So, thank you very much for this fantastic Train the Trainers. My question is really, so you have established your baseline and you have commented the cupcake, scenario where you have the Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3. And there you realize that as an SME, you need to decarbonize. So from your point of view, which scope would be easier to decarbonize first? No. I think it's very important because I am more interested in Scope 2 decarbonization at this stage within my association. Which scope would be much more interesting to do first? Because through time, you will need financing as an SME.
Well, probably the answer lies in the fact that establishing your baseline would give you that insight already, obviously, because you can see from the cupcake example that buying green energy would probably be a smart move for them to make. So having that insight in sort of what is the distribution Scope 1, Scope 2, and maybe Scope 3 gives you what direction where is the sort of where is the potential to decarbonize, and definitely you can then start to roadmap and see what type of measures at what cost and what is this, when will I see the effects as well. So I would say baselining is important to sort of understand where the best bang for buck could be had as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, there's no one-size-fits-all model. That's why I was laughing, because obviously it would be so much easier if we had one, but it's not the case. So baselining really does help, and then it will depend really on the business. In terms of measurements, Scope 1 and 2 might be easier to measure, but we know that for many businesses, the bulk of their emissions is going to lie in their Scope 3 emissions. That said, maybe a lot of your Scope 3 emissions are linked to business travel, and that's something that's quite easy to change. So once again, it will depend on the model of your business.
Thank you so much. I work a lot with startups and entrepreneurs, and many are driven nowadays by this, green concepts, and they want from the start to position themselves in that way. However, obviously, they have so many other issues to handle that going through whole GHG measurement and accounting would be too difficult. And their target market and customer won't be able to grasp that. So there is a need to find some easy tools. I think taking an understanding of your supply chain and where you would generate or where you should highlight the potential for lower emissions at your end is very important. But something easy for startups to understand, to apply, to communicate. Is there something as a best practice, a best certification label, anything that could get them going?
I would.
Well, I'm going to be very biased here because I'm going to mention the SME Climate Hub, which is well suited to very small businesses. We have a community of actually we have almost 9,000 businesses who've committed through the hub, but over 20,000 that are using our tools. And most of our community is made up of businesses with less than 50, a lot of them less than 10 employees. So we're right in that segment in a way. The one thing that we'll say, however, is that for startups who are creating business model that revolve around sustainability, well, the reality is that we probably need to create new frameworks, because if from the very beginning they're looking to develop, low emission products and services, then the frameworks that we have that are about reducing emissions might make a little less sense to them. So right now, the hub, we're also looking at carbon intensity models. Obviously, this needs to be discussed with the rest of the ecosystem, but instead of looking at absolute emissions and how they can decrease that, maybe we can look at carbon intensity and how they can decrease that, and maybe create new rules for also fast-growing SMEs, which is often the case for startups. So I think that we still have a lot of work to do as an ecosystem to best support the innovators, but once again, in terms of very simple tools that they can use, platforms like the hub might be a good port of call.
I don't know how much time.
Yeah, but looking at the organizers, let us know once we need to wrap up. Conscious we're well over time.
Sorry, yeah.
You mentioned that there are going to be some regulations for SMEs to comply to certain criteria. Could you be a bit more specific? When would that time frame be? When they are expected to go into place, or what they would include? Just an estimation, of course. Thank you.
So I don't know, Eelco, if you have the exact answer. What I do know is that the two reporting standards that I mentioned before, and one of them is voluntary. It's called VSME for SMEs, and the other one is for listed SMEs, and it's called LSME. So this is still being worked on. I think that they were just voted on at EFRAG, which is the organization that's been working on developing these standards. They will be submitted to the Commission by the end of this year, so I guess we can expect a decision from the Commission in the first part of next year. In terms of when they're going to be implemented, I'm afraid I don't have the answer. I don't know, Eelco, if you know more.
Escape me, but you should bear in mind that the latter is about listed SMEs, so it's not all SMEs, so it's a subsection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the pressure is going to come, at least in the foreseeable future, the pressure is going to come from the ecosystem more than regulations. But we're going to get there as well in terms of regulations.
Right.
Okay. We're coming to a very natural end, which is quite a feat considering that we had a little less time than planned. Thank you so much all for all the questions. Sticking with us, we hope this was helpful. And obviously feel free to grab us at the coffee break if you have any additional questions.
Thank you.